Game balance, a necessity in any competitive video game. Game designers must execute good game balance in order to achieve a competitive game that will be played and enjoyed by thousands. And if it grows just enough in popularity, it could potentially see itself become an esport. If it isn't designed well, however, then it will attract no one, and you have yourself a flawed competitive game. Follow us as we explore multiple game balance theories that are used in multiple competitive games today. Competition in video games has never been as popular as it is now. With the esports scene being worth greater than $1 billion in 2021 and showing no signs of stopping, developers are encouraged now more than ever to cultivate their own competitive game scene to make a healthy profit. That is why it is important for developers to choose the right strategy to balance their competitive game. Balancing design is not only relevant to the player, but also the spectator. The player's enjoyment of an esport is only half of what determines a competitive game successful. A good spectator experience greatly benefits the exposure that a game will have, attracting more players to it, leading to more growth in market share. Aside from skill focus, a competitive game requires 3 major components. It needs to be interesting, fair, and fun. And what's peculiar about these components is that if you don't have the one that precedes it, then it doesn't matter if you have the latter. Your competitive game won't last. For instance, a game can be as fun as the imagination can take it, but if it's not fair, then people will grow frustrated and a competitive game will fail. Likewise, if your game is fair, but it isn't interesting, then no one is going to care how well it's designed. The fun of the game will eventually diminish and it will become boring. In this video, we will go over some of the most popular balancing theories that are used in games that are played competitively today. We will go over what they are, some examples of their use, and pros and cons that come with the particular balancing design. The most simple of the balancing theories is known as flat balance, otherwise known as one-to-one or symmetric balance. Flat balance is a balancing strategy where there is no deviation between players in any way. No player has an upper hand in any situation whatsoever. An example of such balance used would be the player character of many classic arena shooters. The player controls characters that have the same hitbox, running speed, and models. What the game then becomes is a show of game sense with map knowledge, weapon experience, and aim skill. As one can imagine, this is objectively the most fair way to balance a competitive game, as the only way for one player to win against the other is raw skill. If 2 perfect robots were to play against each other, neither would be able to beat the other because there would be no weakness. However, what makes this type of balancing unappealing is that it would get boring really fast. As fair and as fun as it may be initially, having a flat balance is uninteresting, with no strategy beyond game sense, especially for an audience, which is an important factor in esports. This is why many try to avoid this sort of balance, as it lacks any interesting factor. One example of this type of balance being thought of negatively would be that of Super Smash Bros. Melee and the situation with 20XX. During the early 2010s, the competitive scene of Melee came up with the meme known as 20XX, which was a scenario where Melee's meta would only consist of one viable character, Fox, considered by many to be the best character of Melee.
Aziz has this running joke about, you know in Mega Man, like in the Mega Man intro, it's like the year is 20XX.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Aziz's thing is, the year is 20XX. Everyone plays Fox. And there's this whole like post-apocalyptic universe that is built off of like Fox being the only viable character left.
Yeah.
Or like the tournament metagame has gotten to this point where everything is played out to theoretical perfection. So they rock, paper, scissors for port priority, and then that's the set.
During the mid-2010s, the meme would come closer to reality as most of the pros played Fox, and in tournaments, many of the matchups would consist of Fox versus Fox. Because of this, we can theorize that if 20XX were to become a reality, then the metagame would balance itself out as all matches would become one-to-ones, Fox versus Fox, and it would be determined by who could play Fox better. While this would be fun for a while, and definitely would be the most fair fighting game scene out there was a massive negative response to this end result, as it would result in Melee looking like a flawed game, where players who did not want to play Fox would quit, and spectators of the game would ignore Melee due to the staleness of the meta. While this wasn't the case in the end, it does show how flat balance, while on paper a good idea, is the worst balancing for a growing competitive community, where long-term fun and interest is needed for both the player and the community. Flat balance is absolutely fair and easy to design, but what it has in competition, it lacks in an interesting factor. And while it is everything a competitor would want from a legitimate sport, with the potential for esports to be so much more, flat balance doesn't have enough to keep the stakes high. Not to mention, spectators are the ones that bring in the profit, and they would have no interest in something so stale. Situational balance is where independent tools are tuned up to be better at some situations and worse in others. This shouldn't be confused with counters, as situational balance mostly depends on the environment to be the weakness or the advantage. An example of this type of balance are vehicle parts in many racing games. Some wheels travel faster on dirt compared to asphalt, some car engines have better top speed making them good at long straight stretches, or some cars have more grip allowing them to keep their speed on tighter turns. Based on the situation, some car parts perform better than others. The main pro of this type of balance is that imbalance is felt less harshly compared to other balance types. A single tool may be really good in its situation, but when the tool is used outside of its field, and face to face with one that has the advantage, then the weakness is very apparent. Also, when a player may find themselves in an unfavorable situation, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will lose. Rather, they can use their game sense to make up for the disadvantage and probably still win with their tool of choice. The balance makes up for an interesting component as the stakes are raised or lowered depending on the situation the player finds themselves. The main con of this type of balance is that it could potentially restrict the design of the environments that one can use to make the game as fair as possible. To make it fair for every tool, environments must include every situation for every tool to shine in. However, if it isn't done, then some tools will be at a constant disadvantage, moving players to ditch their tools for another. But then again, it wouldn't be the end of the world as the player can still compete, even in an unfavorable position. The cons of this balance also include when a tool is underpowered because it is too situational, or overpowered because a tool is great in too many situations. If a player uses a tool that is too situational, that it requires a specific set of parameters to do well, then it will just frustrate the player as their moments to shine are restricted to the minimum or not at all. If a game has a tool that is great in too many situations, then the player base will be attracted to it as it overshadows every other tool that isn't in the same league, leading to everyone using it, which leads to the game balancing itself into a flat balance, which again will make the game uninteresting and boring. Even with the negative points of this balance, this type of balance is one that is most commonly used and for a good reason. It is relatively easy to implement and leads to the least amount of frustration with the player in regards to fairness, but still keeps the interesting factor at a good level. If changes are required to make the game more fair, a little bit of bumps and nerfs should be able to do the trick. Role-based balance is where player characters are designated roles that they are very good at doing, while also weak in others. The weaknesses and advantages are not dependent on the environment. This doesn't mean that they counter another character outright, just that they can perform a specific purpose better. While counters may exist to some extent, they are reserved to soft counters, where one role doesn't absolutely overpower the other. Teamwork is a prerequisite to this type of balance, as different roles combine to create a well-built team. An example of this type of balance is with Apex Legends. Each of the legends have abilities that contribute to a role that helps the squad in a unique way. Caustic's traps are for area denial, Bloodhound's scans are for recon, and Lifeline's drone is for health support, and so on and so forth. Each of the legends excel in their own role, while being weak in others. So it is important for each squad mate to choose legends that complement each other, like how Bloodhound's scans complement Bangalore's smokescreens. The main pro of this type of balance is that players are allowed to play a role that fits their preferred playstyle, and excel well in combination with other roles. Each role contributes to the team in their own unique way, and can influence the tide of battle. This allows for deep strategy to be executed by teams, making the gameplay interesting and much more than just about mechanical skill. This brings in a wider scope of players and audiences to a game, as many different playstyles will be able to compete. The main con is that because these characters are designed to be specialists in a specific role, it can be frustrating when a player is caught in a situation where the role is not good at without the help of another character role. Teamwork is essential in this type of balance, and lacking synergy can be detrimental to any team. Another con is that roles have to be fine-tuned to complement other roles and diverse enough to keep the meta dynamic, while also avoiding making any roles overpowered. A role can be overpowered when they encroach on another character's role, making that weaker role irrelevant in the meta. This can lead to players gravitating and consistently choosing the stronger role, leading to a less diverse competitive space and boring meta. Role-based balance may be more complicated to implement and can take a lot longer to properly execute. However, the reward of such balance is plentiful. A dynamic meta that makes each match interesting, stakes changing based on the roles competing for dominance, and a huge diversity of playstyles to attract a wider audience. Truly, this balance theory keeps stakes high and audiences entertained. Tier-based balance means that some tools are designed to be objectively better than other tools, usually on a tiered basis. The weapons are then balanced by making the better weapons harder to acquire or harder to use. Either way, the better weapons are usually a reward for a player's good game sense or mechanical skill. Counter-Strike is a classic example of tier-based balance, as some weapons such as the M4 and the AK-47 are some of the best weapons in the game but cost significantly more than worse weapons like the SMGs. A player must perform better during the match to be rewarded more money to be able to buy better weapons for the next round. Also, the AK and M4 require the player to get accustomed to their spray patterns and spread, giving the guns a higher skill requirement. What makes this type of balance good is that there is a sense of progress for players as the game goes on. This progress is usually done through player performance as a reward for their growth. There's also an implied challenge available for players when they use a lower tier tool. If they can defeat someone with better tools compared to theirs, then it's no longer about the tools. It's about having greater skill to dominate someone at an advantage. Such as an old saying goes, doesn't matter how good your tool is, it's how you use it. This type of balance is negatively affected, however, when the requirements needed to use a tool or weapon doesn't match its effectiveness. If a certain tool is too easy to acquire, then it becomes overpowered. Same with when the requirements needed for a tool are too high, then it becomes underpowered. There can also be a fault in design if the gap between tiers is too high. If a worse tool is significantly worse than a better one by a huge margin, then players who can only acquire the lower tier tools will definitely feel as if the game is unfair, because the moment the opponent gets a better tool, it's basically a game over. Returning to Counter-Strike as an example, even though the automatic snipers have a huge purchasing cost, much of the community considers those weapons near impossible to fight against, as they can kill opponents at a long range, in a short time, in a rapid succession. So the fun of the match is ruined the moment someone hears those spine-chilling shots. Tier-based balancing may be the greatest compromise between raw skill and strategy. While the disparity in effective tools may cause some frustration, it's usually never big enough that it throws skill out the window. And even when someone is at a disadvantage, victory is determined more by the better player. And who doesn't like a good underdog story? Counter-based balancing, also known as rock, paper, scissors balancing. Counterbalance is a design theory where gameplay is focused on tools or characters that consistently overpower a specific set of other tools or characters, just like in rock, paper, scissors, where rock always beats scissors, scissors always beats paper, and paper always beats rock. The strategy comes from switching to the appropriate tool to counter the enemy. The most well-known example of this balance is Overwatch, where some heroes hard counter other heroes such as Reaper's Shotgun against big hitboxes as Winston, hit-scan heroes such as McCree and Ashe countering movement-based heroes such as Pharah and Mercy, and Torbjorn with a Sentry being a counter to slippery heroes like Tracer. Because of these counters, much of Overwatch's strategy revolves around choosing the right hero for the right enemy composition, so that the player can get a good counter advantage. The main pro of this type of balance is that matchups are easy to understand and to adapt towards. Strategic potential is also very high, as weaknesses are very apparent, and because of it, a player can choose an advantageous counter. The fault starts when a character doesn't have an effective counter for itself, and thus goes uncontested and is considered overpowered. This is the same for characters that aren't strong against any character, as that means that they will not perform well and become underpowered. Another con is the frustration for players that choose to play a specific set of characters. Frustration starts when they are being forced to switch from their preferred character to prevent themselves from being hard countered or to gain an upper hand. This is especially when a player is using a character that they are most comfortable with and dislike the other character necessary to win. There is no real way to remedy this issue other than external incentives. A player could continue to play their character of choice, but this would be the equivalent of always playing paper when the opponent is always putting scissors. Counter-based balance is a good choice when strategy is more important than raw skill. It's a battle of wits and who can outsmart the other at the right time. While it does have its faults in frustration, the stakes that it can have are definitely good, especially when seeing how popular Overwatch as an esport has been. Competitive game balancing is always going to be tricky, and it will appear as if no one will ever be completely pleased by it. But that's okay, a competitive game doesn't need to be completely balanced to be successful. Just keep in mind that when designing a competitive game, you remember to make it fun, fair, and most importantly, interesting.